welcome everybody. It's a huge treat to be back here again today, and it's a real privilege to be in conversation with my friend and colleague Mary Beard. You all know, as we've just heard, that Mary is this, extraordinary writer, wonderful presenter, hugely entertaining force for good on social media. But she's also a really extraordinary colleague. And so I want to take the opportunity to say in public a big thank you to her for being a really, really supportive colleague, especially to younger people in academia and especially to younger women. So thank you for that.
Oh, is this what? Yes, it is. No pressure then.
But what we're here to talk about today is this wonderful book, Emperor of Rome. I always think that reading Mary's books is like being in a tutorial with her, being in a tutorial with the most funny, interesting tutor you can possibly imagine, who knows more than all the others. And this book, it's a complete joy to read. And if any of you haven't got it yet, I really very, very highly recommend taking this opportunity to make friends with the emperors of Rome up here. But what I want to start off with, Mary, was your last big book about Roman history, SPQR, was mostly focused on the Roman Republic, not entirely, mostly. Now, this book is about the subsequent period when Rome had emperors. And those terms that we use, republic, emperor, and so on, they suggest a really kind of dramatic shift from collective to individual power between those two periods. And I wondered, is it a bit more complicated than that?
You know what the answer to that is. Yes, it is more complicated. I think there is absolutely no doubt that we see the period that follows the assassination of Julius Caesar, still probably the most famous assassination in world history. We see that as a change from collective rule to a time in which what counts in the Roman world is who the guy at the top is on his own individually, and what we get excited about still, and they're still familiar to us, actually, in some ways, is the personality, the character of these one-man rulers who followed Julius Caesar. And up to a point, that's really important. There is a change of how you imagine power. But what I hope this book does is to say, look, we all know that no one-man ruler rules alone, right? That is impossible. You can look at all the guys who we fantasize about being lone, dramatic, twisted tyrants. And we can think of plenty of them now, and I won't prompt you, but there's plenty of them. And in a way, we're kidding ourselves. The important thing about something like the Roman Empire, or the American Empire, or the Russian Empire, or the British, or whatever, is nobody rules alone. The figure of the emperor is hugely important, but he's not doing everything. So one of the things I think that this book, the new book, does is look at the collectivity of rule in a different way. Look at the people who managed the finances. Look at the slaves who were the emperor's barbers, the slaves who did the accounting. And to say, look, we can reconstruct them. When I was at uni, I was taught that you didn't know anything. We couldn't find out anything about people below the very top rank of Roman society, and the men at that. Well, I think what I hope that the book does is to show you can tell a hell of a lot about the people who made the emperor possible. You know? Whether that's his food taster or whatever. And if you go to the main palace in Rome now, the Palatine Palace, you'll still find more traces literally written on the wall by the enslaved servants doing all this job for the Roman emperor than you'll find, I'm afraid, of the Roman emperor himself. So this is a new sort of collectivity.
So, following on from that, one of the wonderful just little details that you kind of drop into this book is that the Chinese Empire, at the same time as the Roman Empire, had proportionately 20 times more senior administrators than Rome. So, I guess the question is, why didn't the Roman emperors build up a kind of civil service like that?
God only knows, really. But in part, I think that the palace machine goes on being a private elite Roman house, enormously expanded. You know, if you think about how the Roman Empire was governed, how the people were chosen, even the upmarket guys were chosen to go and govern provinces or whatever. There was no exam. There appears to be, and we think of it as a bureaucracy, but bureaucracies are characterized by kind of rules of promotion. You know, are you on the fast track in the civil service or not? Well, people have tried, modern scholars have tried to look at how the Roman Empire was run underneath the figure of the emperor, tried to find the fast track, tried to find the people who were being kind of eased up the civil service. And it is all very much hand to mouth. It's, bribery, we call it corruption, they'd call it patronage, right? It's the same thing. It depends whose side you're on. Bribery, corruption, patronage, and kind of making do. I mean, the Roman Empire, we have this kind of incredible vision of, disaffected legionaries yomping across marshes about to obliterate some poor native tribe. It is a series of improvisations, cross fingers, hoping you get things right. And the Roman Empire, as an imperial system, doesn't have many great ambitions. Basically what the Roman Empire wants is it wants the taxes to come in and there to be no trouble. Right? It doesn't want to make everybody believe the same thing. There isn't a direct civilizing mission, however crude that would be. So if you have relatively limited ambitions, it's quite easy to run things on a shoestring, which is what they did, and they incorporated the local elites who'd already been raising the taxes in the province. It's not that the Romans conquered places that had been, Asterix-like, happily knitting and having magic potion for the last 10,000 years. They'd been ruled by somebody else mostly, and they said take over those structures, and as long as nothing goes wrong, they're fine. And you don't need so many boots on the ground to make sure nothing goes wrong.
But that brings up this thing that always confuses me, at least, is when imperial is to do with the emperor and when it's to do with the empire. And so, can you just tell us what does the Roman Empire have to do with the Roman emperor?
Well, again, that is, I think, one of the aims I had when I was writing the book was actually to explain that as simply as possible. The average person, me included until I was about 35, I think, you assume that the Roman emperors formed the Roman Empire. Now, it looks kind of obvious. Now, that is absolutely, fundamentally wrong, right? It goes the other way round, in fact. Romans in the period of sort of democracy that I've largely covered in the previous book. It is that earlier period when, for whatever reason, Rome became the dominant power in and beyond the Mediterranean. They formed the Roman Empire when they were a democracy, right? Now, we never like that because we like democracies to be nice. But in this case, it is the democracy, for unknown reasons, honestly, managed to have a series of fantastically successful campaigns, which gave them an empire. The emperors had zilch to do with it. Now, in a way, the empire that they gained, and even on my level of kind of understanding of, limited aspirations, the empire with its problematic administrative burdens and, look, it takes you 3 months to get a message to the middle of Turkey, right? So it's hard work doing the admin. In a way, the empire destroyed the democracy because they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it in that way with people holding office only for 1 year at a time. And the empire created one-man rule in its funny form, with its different sort of collectivity, but they created permanent rule. And I think the basic message, I would die happy if I'd got this across to the world at large, is that the emperors did not create the empire in its territorial extent created the emperors. And emperors go on dressing themselves up in silly little military costume to imply that they are great conquerors, because every Roman wants to be a great conqueror. And they put enormous phallic columns up in the centre of Rome saying, look what I conquered. The truth is that those are what some people have called vanity projects. Trajan's conquest of Dacia that we still see on his column lasted, not half as long as his column, not 1/10 as long as his column. And Trajan's conquest of Mesopotamia, which he bragged about forever, lasted about 6 months. The only place the Romans conquer after the reign of Augustus, on top left, with any longevity is Britain. And that was a complete disaster. It's like Afghanistan, right? It was never properly, put that in inverted commas, never properly in Roman terms conquered, and it always cost an enormous amount of money. But so it's conquest is pre-imperial, emperors come later.
Brilliant. So
don't forget that.
Right, there's going to be a test on the way out. So we get onto the emperors. You do almost 300 years, almost 30 emperors. But I think one of the things that's just kind of inspired about this book is that, unlike almost every historian who's dealt with Roman emperors before, ancient or modern, you don't take a biographical approach or a chronological approach, but you structure the book around chapters on specific themes. And so I was wondering, why did you choose to do that, and how did you choose the topics?
I chose to do it because it's by far the best way of doing it, I decided. But also, and this is meant to be extremely reassuring, I do about 30 emperors, and I say about because you can never quite be sure who counts as a pretender and who's an emperor, but about 30 emperors. You can pick up this book never having heard of a single one, and I hope you will get a lot out of it. You certainly do not need to know, to go to the bottom row, whether Antoninus Pius came before Marcus Aurelius. You don't. And you can take comfort in the fact that most Romans didn't know either, right? No? Go back to Britain, they hadn't even heard of them, right? So what I'm trying to say is that modern historians, and to some extent ancient historians, people like Tacitus and Suetonius, when they were wondering how to tell the story of this period of Rome's history, a period in which, let me say, the truth is not much happens. I mean, between the reign of Augustus and where I finish in about 230s, I said there's not much conquest. It's, broadly speaking, a very similar system, some minor changes. But if you'd gone to sleep in 1 BC and woken up in 201 CE, you'd have recognised the world around you. And actually, that's always been periods in which not much happens. Has always been a big problem for historians. How do you tell the story of a period where nothing happens, right? And most people have taken the biographical route, and they've pretended, and it is a total pretense, they pretended that you will only understand this period if you know who exactly every individual emperor was and what he was like. The mean Tiberius, the mad Caligula, the scholarly Claudius, the lurid Nero, and you can go on. Now, there have been some quite interesting biographies. I wouldn't want to knock them, but I don't think it tells you almost nothing about how imperial power works. And there are some very, very kind of luridly intriguing individual anecdotes told about all sorts of them, and we had a few named. They always look a bit different when you discover those anecdotes were told about lots of emperors, not just one, right? So pinning these guys down is really hard. Now, I have to confess, go to the middle of the bottom line. Marcus Aurelius is still the best-selling writer about ancient Rome that there is. And his meditations, I'm afraid, outsell both Joe and myself in the modern world.
This is an outrage, and you must do something about it.
It is either very cheering or deeply irritating, right?
I know which one.
Yeah. I don't know, many of you probably do own a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. They're the biggest loads of cliches that, aren't they? Yeah, total cliches. Why
really, really dull.
Why President Clinton kept them on his bedside table, we don't know. Anyway, Marcus Aurelius, I'm usually not a great fan of, but in these rather cliched meditations, he says one thing which I think is just totally true. He looks back at his predecessors on the Roman throne and says, basically, same play, different cast. Actually, of course they're different. Edward VII was different from George V, but they were much more similar than they were different. And I think the key to these emperors is that although we've invested in their idiosyncrasies, because it kind of suits us and they're fun. What did Tiberius do in the swimming pool with the little boys, right? I shall not say, but you can find it very easily on Google, right? We've invested in that, and that's obscured from us that basically they're the same sorts of people doing the same kind of job from the same place with the same staff and so on. So what I decided to do is to say, look, I like the anecdotes. I hope we'll come back to them in a minute. But I'm going to say, what's the job description of a Roman emperor? And what do they share? And I think that starts to open up a whole series of aperçus that are preoccupation with the individual characteristics, and particularly the individual character, totally lost to us really, but we fantasize about it, that you can go beyond that and see what sort of job it was. And if you look at it that way, the Roman Empire starts to look very different. It's not ruled actually by by a whole load of barking psychopaths. If it had been ruled by a load of barking psychopaths, it wouldn't have lasted, would it, right? So you start to see how that power worked. You also start to see how the emperors were understood. You start to look at the fantasies about them. But ultimately, let me tell you, just as a sort of basic take-home point, the Roman emperor spent a lot more time signing letters than he did in the swimming pool. Right? And once you've grasped that point, the Roman Empire opens up to you in a little more interesting detail, I think.
Okay, so the kind of central message of this book is the interchangeability of these emperors. And that is something that is not only a really interesting idea, it's pretty radical in academic terms. But I want to, not unusually, I have to say, but I want to push you on this. Okay, these emperors are interchangeable, but go on, who is the most typical and who is the least typical?
Well, I can't answer that, but what I can tell you, and I think what is important, and this is why not doing them as individuals I think really works for me, is that good emperors, in the tradition that we've inherited about them, are good in the same way. Right? And bad emperors are all bad in the same way. Some more extremely than others. There's a bit of a mix-up sometimes, but good emperors are generous to the citizens of Rome. They reward the army appropriately. They have vanity conquests that everybody gets very excited about, even if they leave it, and they build monuments for the benefit of the Roman people, bathhouses, theatres, amphitheatres, and so forth. Bad emperors are luxurious, spendthrift, humiliate the aristocracy, humiliate the poor, and take sometimes generosity to extremes. So the Emperor Caligula goes up on the roof of a building in the Forum because he hasn't quite got what generosity is. So he just throws money at the people in the Forum. Now, what you see is that the more you try to excavate those stereotypes, there's nothing underneath. You know, the stereotypes actually are the emperor. Now, that's putting it a bit strong. What you find underneath is all sorts of interesting, fascinating information about how the emperor and his staff are running the place. You know, how they're answering people's begging letters, how they're adjudicating, you know, murder cases in Turkey and whatever. You find something about that, but you don't get, sadly, you don't get to them. And if you look at the bottom line of this lot, from Hadrian to Septimius Severus, you'll see that they all look the same. Now, we have no idea what these guys really look like, but they are made to look the same. That doesn't mean there's no contest about this, though, but I'll let Josephine ask me the next question, and if I decide to answer it slightly differently, I will.
Well, and what I wanted to ask you, since we're looking at these emperors now, and one of the things I should say that is so brilliant about this book is there are loads and loads of pictures, not just the usual lovely colour pictures in the middle, but pictures all the way through and a lot of them are of these guys. And one of the points that you make very strongly is that the Roman Empire was saturated with images of the emperors on statues like these, on coins, even on paintings, most of which don't survive. And so I was just wondering if you could, when people are looking at these sorts of things all the time, what are they actually getting from them? What are these images saying to the people looking at them?
You mentioned painting. Here's one of the very rare paintings that survive of a Roman emperor, Septimius Severus and his wife Julia Domna and his children underneath. On the right-hand side, there's Caracalla. On the left-hand side, the blob is where Caracalla's brother Gaeta once was, but Caracalla murdered Gaeta. So his face has been eradicated. One of the most famous, for an ancient story, one of the most famous murders in Roman history, though it hasn't got the popular appeal quite of Julius Caesar's assassination. Caracalla had Gaeta murdered after the death of Dad on Julia Domna's lap, and Gaeta's last words were supposed to have been, "Mummy, mummy, I'm being killed." And I think that's either terrible or so pathetic. You can't work out which. You know, I think it sums up how difficult it is to judge this material. What was the question? Oh, what do we get out of all these things? Yeah, I mean, the Roman Empire, starting from Julius Caesar, is the first time anybody in the ancient Western world, at least, twigged that brand image was important. I mean, there are a few little prequels, very few, in some of the slightly earlier kings of the Eastern Mediterranean. And Augustus in particular, Julius Caesar didn't live long enough, actually saw that images were substitutes for the real thing. And he flooded the Roman world with his image, literally flooded it. There was probably once, there's now about 1,000 images surviving, guaranteed to be him, probably about 50,000 or more images across the Roman world. And what you are doing is you are giving people, and this is, I have to say, a much more innovative aspect of Roman emperors than anything they might have done in conquest or anything they might have done to be nasty to the elite or whatever. It is to make their faces absolutely ubiquitous, both in sculpture, as Joe said, in painting, but also in coins. And Julius Caesar was the first Roman, living Roman, to have his head on the coin. And that has never stopped. You know, why we have King Charles on our coins is because of Julius Caesar. That was where the tradition originated, and it never went away. And what it does is it gives you a range, a limited range of possibilities for imagining who rules us. And you can see they're nicely calibrated in similarity and difference. And one of the puzzling things is after Hadrian, they all pretty much all have beards. Why they started having beards in the 2nd century, we have no clue, right? But they do. And what you're seeing is an attempt, when the emperor can't be everywhere. You know, most people in the Roman world will never have seen the Roman emperor. They probably won't even have seen the governor of their province. But what they will have seen every time they pay for something in the local market in a monetized economy, or go to the local town and see the statues of these guys, they'll be told that's what power is. It changes the whole landscape of your world. You know, you're suddenly, even in, let's say, Colchester, in a world that is populated by these guys. And I think, you know, there's a tendency for us now, in terms of modern dictatorships, to be a bit sniffy about this, to say, oh, yes, you go there and go down. You know, there's a picture of the dictator everywhere, right? And we think as if we don't do that. But the Roman world, there was a picture of the emperor everywhere. And I'm afraid King Charles or King Charles's representatives are doing the same, saying you can get your free picture of the king to hang up in your local courtroom or post office or whatever. And it all starts here. And we do it slightly differently. And it doesn't seem, I think this would have seen, when Augustus now looks terribly sort of, you know, a bit boring really. When people first saw that, and saw it in many replicas in the city of Rome, they must have thought, wow, this is something new. This is a new image of power. So we are inheriting now, as a very conventionalized image of power, what was once something mind-bogglingly innovative.
So another kind of innovative thing was the names people called these emperors, Caesar, princeps, that kind of thing. But one thing that they didn't call them really was emperor, and you often describe them as autocrats in the book, which I thought was a very nicely chosen term. But so why is it, given that they didn't call themselves emperor, people didn't call them that, even you don't really call them that, why do we call them emperors? And what are the sort of pluses and minuses of that term?
Well, it goes back to the big old mistake that the Roman emperors made the empire. And they rule over an empire, and so what are they? What's the person who rules over an empire? They're an emperor. And it's convenient, and I don't remotely want to abolish the term, but it sort of implies that there is a kind of standard way of addressing the emperor, of seeing his job in his title, and it's much more fragile than that. I mean, one of the interesting things about the power base of these individuals is that it is so hard to pin down. It is so hard to define. I mean, if you went up to any of these guys and you got a request, I mean, probably what you'd have said was Caesar. You'd probably have said, "Excuse me, Caesar, can I?" Right? Now, that's what Suetonius, when he's writing the biographies of the first 12 emperors, including Julius Caesar, that's what he calls them. They're Caesars. That's probably the commonest phrase. But they agonise and pussyfoot all the time. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, I was taught that Augustus, first proper emperor after Caesar, he invented a new title, right? Princeps. Right? And that meant first amongst equals, the first citizen. And it was, I was taught, to try to get around the problem that he was a one-man ruler in a state that had not been used to that kind of thing. So he's the princeps. Now, you can find the word princeps in Roman writing, but nobody goes up to Augustus and says, "Excuse me, princeps," right? And they're using different titles, sometimes foregrounding, to kind of pick out different aspects of their rule. They might be imperator sometimes, which is where our word emperor obviously comes from. But that's mostly in a military context. Imperator is a very military word. So they're putting together a whole range of ways of calling themselves to sort of manage the tightrope between being dictator and being aristocrat or amongst equals. And even Augustus, I mean, we look at these names. I mean, the point about Augustus, first emperor still gives us our month, August. Most people, I think, forget that we live under the sign of Augustus in August. It wasn't his real name. His real name was Octavius. And in the run-up to him taking power, he'd actually been a horrible thug, really vile, vicious thug. Apparently, clawing people's eyes out with his own hands and other kind of things like that. When he came to power, he decided that he needed a new image, right? So he invents a new name. And he has all kinds of worries about what name to pick. And he eventually picks Augustus. Augustus means nothing. If it means anything in Latin, it means revered one, right? And it is, to us now, first Roman emperor was the revered one. It sounds ever so North Korean. And I suspect it sounded pretty North Korean, on the Roman street in 10 BC, Augustus. And I don't think many of us went and said, "Hail Augustus." So the naming, the nomenclature, how they present themselves, it's always within a kind of broadly similar parameter. They're all doing the same kind of thing. Not a good idea to be called God, by the way, during a lifetime, but you could be God afterwards.
All the same, the emperor wasn't the only rich and powerful man in Rome. And so I wanted to ask you, the others, the senators, the other aristocrats, who kind of went along with this, who let there be one man rule. I mean, why did they do that? What was in it for them?
I think this is where there's a lesson for us. I don't think there's many lessons, direct lessons in ancient history, but here there is one. And I think our image of the Roman Empire and its rulers, and let's say people we have learned to think of as tyrants like Nero or Caligula, the image we have is that the Senate, the old aristocracy, were always opposed to these guys. And I think the self-serving image we have too is that had we been Romans, we would have been. You know? And if now we had an autocrat dictator, we would stand up and be counted, and we'd say, I'm not going along with this. I think the answer, for whatever reason, is that the Roman aristocracy went along with the system of one-man rule. They certainly, they killed a lot of emperors, but that was not because they didn't like the imperial system. They just didn't happen to like this emperor, and they had a favoured candidate. From about the first half of the 1st century CE, that's within 50 years of there being a one-man ruler, we hear of no direct opposition to one-man rule by any of the aristocrats. There might have been such, they might have muttered at dinner, but there is no anti-imperial kind of opposition, which we would always have liked to think we have. Now, I think that it's easy to get confused. One can get confused by that because the Roman aristocracy, happy to go along with things mostly, as long as they're not humiliated. You know, they don't like running after the emperor's chariot. They like having nice, simple suppers with the leader and feeling kind of on terms of bonhomie. They like that. They're also very adaptable when a new regime comes along. So if a new regime comes along, for example, after the assassination of one emperor, let's say Domitian, and you get a new man in power, they're just as good as we are, actually, at saying, oh, I never liked Domitian, really. You know, I was always right. Frankly, I was keeping my head down. I always thought I might be next on the list for exile. Thank heavens Nerva is now in control. I've always wanted him. So we're seeing these, and we're seeing Romans' attitudes to emperors through a kind of fog of fascinating self-servingness, where they, reposition themselves just like we do. I don't know the real intricacies of the Tory party, and I don't think they're quite as good at as Roman senators are at repositioning themselves, but most of them are quite good. So I never liked Liz Truss anyway, Well, in the Roman Empire, there's a lot of I never liked Liz Truss anyway going on.
Okay, so continuing this vein, I've got a more specific question for you, which is one of the things that comes out reading your book is just how good these senators are at killing themselves to order. In fact, they don't even have to be ordered by the emperor to kill themselves. They just have to get a kind of dismissive remark in public, and they obediently trot home and run a hot bath and open their veins. And I think, why? Wasn't it even worth trying to escape?
That is one of the most puzzling things. Now, the Roman admiration of suicide, up to a point, and the Roman sense that suicide was one of the options you had for solving a problem. Now, the Roman Empire, basically, the bottom line of problem solving in the Roman Empire is violence. You know, you might try other ways. You might think that Roman law might help you. It doesn't very much. And the way problems get solved is either by killing somebody else or killing yourself. But it is also kind of hugely curated and rhetoricized in the sources that we have, to kind of turn suicide into the ultimate end of a career. My favourite example of that really is not Seneca, who had been rather foolishly engaged in a plot against Nero and tried to kill himself and failed until, well, he needed an awful lot of help. It's a terrible story. But there is a pretty much unknown guy in the reign of Augustus, and he had been a bit leaky. He was near the centre of power, but he'd been a bit leaky. And he had told his wife, who had told somebody else, about what Augustus's plans for his successor were. And it had got out, and Augustus had realised, you know, that he was better at looking for moles and finding them than the modern civil service. He knew who the mole was. And when the mole turns up at dinner the next night, or at Augustus's, actually it wasn't dinner, it was his morning kind of audience, the mole says, "Hello, Caesar." And Augustus just looks at him and says, "Goodbye, Gaius." He goes home and kills himself. You know, and it's a kind of sense of, it's really the kind of absolute reductio ad absurdum of the problem that you're talking about. That there are these minor slights, these minor infractions, and your option is to remove yourself. And you know, it's one of the most problematic things I think about, and for us puzzling things about Roman culture. Another guy under Nero is out at night with his wife. Nero is a bit of a lad, and so that's putting it in a pre-Me Too phase. And he makes a rather crude pass at the wife of the senator. And the senator bashes Nero up. And he realises, as he's bashing him up, that he isn't bashing up this kind of wide boy from the street. He's bashing up the emperor. Goes home and writes a letter of apology to the emperor. That, it is pointed out to him, is the worst that he could have done. Because Nero then says, "So he knew it was me." And he also kills himself. And so you see that coming in as the kind of punchline. And often I suspect these things are not true. You know, I have to say, I think they're not true. But they're part of a way of really underlining how imperial power works. And imperial power doesn't work just because of the violence that the emperor can inflict. It works through rumour, self-inflicted violence, and the power that no one can ever quite put a finger on. You know, so he knew it was me then. That's it.
Okay, we'll go to Q&A in a second, but I do just want to take this opportunity, now I've got my tutorial with you, to ask about the most absurd thing that I found in the whole book, something that I had never come across before, which is about Septimius Severus and the Dying Waxwork. Can you please tell us about Septimius Severus and the Dying Waxwork and explain why it happened?
Just as we know, royal funerals are important. Septimius Severus, see him on the bottom row, dies in Britain and is cremated in Britain. But you still need a funeral. So he's going to be buried in Rome, except there is no body. Right? So what they do, apparently, all of this is apparently, is they make a waxwork image of him and they lay him out in front of the palace. But they don't just say, all right, let's bury the waxwork. They have doctors coming up at different times of the day saying, I think he's getting worse. I'm afraid he's getting worse.
For days, right?
Days, and eventually they say, terribly sorry. Afraid he's not survived. And then they go through with the funeral. Now, it is, I think I say in the book, it's kind of a bit hard to imagine how Romans kept a straight face sometimes at this kind of stuff. Where it leads me, and I think what's interesting about it, is one very big theme about Roman imperial power. It's fakery and acting and pretense. And one of the things that many of these stories home in on is the idea that the power of the emperor is all a bit of an act. It's all fake. And you see that very clearly with the Emperor Nero, who also, when I was a kid, you learned these anecdotes about how he was very keen on acting, used to go to the theatre, would have the theatre locked up while he was performing so no one could escape. Women gave birth while he was performing. Men pretended to be dead, so they could get out. And I used to write these things in essays very dutifully. It's only recently I thought, why are they telling those stories? I don't know if they're true or not, but what are those stories really about? Why be so preoccupied with Nero on stage? And that is partly because it's homing in on one of the big questions that underlie all this, which is the emperor just an actor anyway? And, I remember very vividly seeing Rishi Sunak pretending to fill his car with petrol when it was the fuel crisis to show he was one of us. Except he clearly didn't know how to work a petrol pump. And so that was very much, is this just an act? But I think rather more positively, I was touched really, and it's a good place to stop this, by the late Queen after she'd done her Paddington Bear video. Apparently, and I only have this about fifth hand, but it's a good story, even if it's not entirely true. The producer, after she'd done this, said, "Mum, you really are rather a good actor, actually." And she said, "Are you surprised? It's all I do."
And on that note, what questions do we have for Mary? Yes, that lady there. There are microphones, I think. We're trying to look now. Great, so...
Your
question about the women.
Yes, the question about the women here. Let's go, but let's show a woman. Yeah. Sorry, whoops. Oh, we're not going to get a woman. People have suggested to me...
There were women.
That this is a very funny book for a feminist to write, because there were no female emperors. One of the things I do, and we might, as good feminists, have talked about it, but we got waylaid, was to say, but look, we have in this story, and in the story that we see in BBC's I, Claudius or Suetonius, there are this series of usually villainous, but certainly powerful women, like Augustus's wife, Livia, Claudius, his wife and Nero's mother, Agrippina, who are written into the story as not powerful in their own right, but as controlling. They manage things, usually by poison. Now, I still, and I hope I get my ambivalence across in the book, I'm still very torn between the idea that, look, here are some women actually doing something and getting their own way, right? And setting out, in Livia's case, to get her son Tiberius onto the throne. Why should I disbelieve these stories of poisoning? I now tend more to come down on the side of that this is an actual classic, one of the earliest cases of a political blame the woman story. You know, that how the problem about the imperial palace, collectivity as it is, compared with the previous sort of democratic system, is that decisions are made within four walls. We can't see the decisions being made. The Romans couldn't see. They wondered how they knew. Now, very often in the history of politics ever since, and political commentary, is when the men have really messed up, they blame the women. And it's easier to do that when it's within four walls. So how do you explain the awkward bits about the reign of the emperors? Well, you usually pin the blame on a woman, poisoning, the classic woman's crime, right? You know, polluted cookery, you know, that's what poisoning is. And we do it. You know, I remember when Sherry Blair was blamed for everything, Carrie Johnson's been blamed for everything, Nancy Reagan was blamed for everything. And, you know, one of the biggest strands of misogyny in the Western political playbook is to blame the women when the men fuck up, basically.
Over here, sir.
Even Liz Truss, perhaps. Perhaps.
Thanks very much to both of you for that. And without wishing to sound like I've completely missed the point about the interchangeability of the emperors, Mary, do you have a favourite or least favourite emperor to write about?
I think it's all very hard. What I would, if I was encouraging someone to go and find a really interesting emperor that they didn't know much about, which is almost the same as favourite, not quite, I would say, bottom right, go and look up Gabalus, right? Because Gabalus was a Syrian teenager, actually, and he was on the throne between the ages of 14 and 18. Why he is so interesting, we can know nothing about him, is that he is the absolute classic empty vessel for saying and explaining why he's bad, right? So he attracts the most extravagant anecdotes, almost all bad. Not quite, perhaps, but almost all bad. And I think that if you read, there's one surviving life of Gabalus written in the ancient world, which you can easily look up. And there's some bits in narrative histories too, and you'll find the references in the book. You get a very, very vivid idea of the bad emperor. If you go and look at the untrue, no doubt, stories about Gabalus, my favourite, and I think it's everybody's favourite really when they come across it, is he tries to be generous. Because that's what emperors should be, has people to dinner, and how is his generosity to be manifest? Showering them with rose petals. You know, Romans love showering things from the ceiling. That's the best. You know, whether it's fruit, knocks you on the head, but never mind. That was Domitian. But Gabalus does rose petals from the ceiling. The only trouble is he does so many of them that the guests smother and die. Right? And, you know, this is the classic anecdote, I think, for thinking about imperial power, really, although it doesn't often get told. You think, this must be untrue. You know, you cannot smother people. Sorry, not true. It's impossible. So why are they so keen on that? Why do they want to tell that? And I came to the conclusion it was going again to the heart of anxieties about imperial power. If you go to the Roman palace, you can't ever trust the generosity of the emperor. The generosity which looks as if it's generous, but damn it, it kills you. And I think the message about Gabalus is imperial power humiliates and kills when it looks as if it's being kind. It's killing with kindness.
Yeah. Thank you very much again. Could you correct me if my understanding is not correct, that the picture you showed us of the Septimius, that he had a physiognomy of very much of an African, North African descent. Am I wrong in my interpretation of that?
Septimius Severus certainly comes from North Africa, comes from Libya. It is a huge controversy, and it is an insoluble, and he's almost certainly, it's going to be an insoluble controversy, what his ethnicity was. It's very likely that he had a North African mother, but Joe will perhaps help me out on this, but we have no idea of where in North Africa she came, what ethnicity, and he probably had an Italian dad. And we have very different representational modes. I mean, if you look at him here on the bottom row, he looks just like all the others, right? Now, his statue probably was painted. That might have made a difference. If we look at the painting that I showed you, he looks as if he has a dark skin. You are then confronted, or I'm confronted, with the idea that that might be a very rare attempt to represent what we know to be the effect of the Roman world and the whole, as it wasn't white. It might be a rare attempt to represent an emperor who was not like what you see in the movies. It also, however, and this is the problem, it goes back to a convention of ancient painting, which is that men in ancient painting have their skins painted dark and women have their skins painted white. You see that in Greek vase painting, for example. So it is the most elusive bit. And it could be that Septimius Severus looked like what he looked like on the painting. Could be that he looked like what he looks like here. And we just don't know. And I think one message is that anybody who says we can be sure about the ethnicity of Septimius Severus is wrong, right? Like Gabalus, Gabalus is Syrian, but there is a wide spread of diversity at some level. Hadrian is Spanish. But it's very hard to pin it down to ethnicity or race in modern terms, because Romans aren't talking about it in those terms. They dislike his accent, but that's quite different.
Okay, I'm afraid we are out of time now, but let's thank Mary for a wonderful presentation.